tied to a surfboard and abandoned in the crashing waves. A tiny German Shepherd puppy was left to drown, but fate had other plans. What happened next not only saved his life, but transformed him into a hero who would touch countless hearts. This is the story of survival, second chances, and a bond that refused to sink. Before we move on, if you're an animal lover, tap subscribe. It's completely free, and every click inspires us to keep sharing the stories that truly touch the heart and give a voice to those who can't speak for themselves. The ocean can be cruel. At dawn, when the horizon still glows with bruised shades of gray and orange, the tide sometimes brings in things no one wishes to see: splintered wood, tangled nets, even the wreckage of lives left behind. On this morning, it carried something far more disturbing. A surfboard drifted slowly toward the shore, rocking unevenly, its nose dipping into the swell, its tail dragging behind. At first glance, it looked like abandoned gear, left to wander after a careless afternoon in the waves. But as the light grew, something unnatural stood out. There was movement, small, weak, irregular. Cole was the first to notice. A solitary figure on the beach, he often walked there before the world woke. The sand was his sanctuary, though the water was not. He kept his distance from the sea itself, watching it with wary eyes. Cole knew its beauty and its power, but also its merciless appetite. He had lost too much to it already. This morning, his gaze locked on the drifting board. As it floated closer, he froze. Atop the battered fiberglass, tied down with fraying rope, was a bundle of fur, soaked, trembling, and barely lifting its head. It wasn't gear at all. It was a living creature. Cole's heart lurched. A puppy. The waves shoved the board nearer until the scene became impossible to ignore. The ropes dug into the pup's wet fur, binding its tiny body to the board. Its paws scraped weakly at the surface, claws clicking against fiberglass in desperate, useless motions. The animal was tied in place, deliberately abandoned to the sea. Cole didn't hesitate. He dropped his jacket, sprinted forward, and plunged into the surf. The cold was a shock, biting his skin, but adrenaline carried him through. The board bobbed and pulled with each wave, dragging the small prisoner farther out with every surge. Cole swam hard, his chest tightening, salt water splashing into his mouth as he fought to reach it. By the time he reached the board, the puppy's eyes were half closed. Its breathing was shallow, rapid, the kind that came before stillness. Cole grabbed the edge, pulled it toward him, and with fumbling fingers worked at the knots. The rope was soaked and stiff, but desperation gave him strength. Finally, the last coil gave way, and the puppy collapsed into his arms, limp but alive. He turned, fighting the current back to shore. Every stroke burned his muscles. The puppy was heavier than it looked, sodden and weak, its small chest barely moving. Cole pressed it against him, keeping its head above water. The surf slammed against his back, but he pushed through, teeth gritted, eyes locked on the sand ahead. When he stumbled onto the beach, gasping, he laid the pup on the wet sand. For a moment, everything stilled. The waves hissed behind him. The puppy didn't move. "No, no, no," Cole muttered, pressing his palms against the tiny chest. He rubbed, coaxed, begged. Then, with a tiny shudder, the puppy coughed. A weak spray of seawater dribbled from its mouth. Its body twitched. Its eyes fluttered open. Relief crashed over Cole harder than any wave. "You're alive," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You're still here." He pulled the trembling creature against him, cradling it beneath his shirt for warmth. The pup's fur was slick and cold, its ribs too visible, its body frail. Whoever had done this hadn't cared if it lived or died. But the ocean, in its unpredictable way, had spared it. Cole rose to his feet, clutching the pup close. For a long moment, he stared at the horizon, that endless stretch of water that had taken so much from him. His parents' faces flickered in his memory, the day the sea swallowed them still carved into his soul. And now here it was again, testing him, forcing him to confront what he most feared. But this time, he had saved something. This time, the ocean hadn't won. He carried the puppy up the beach, footprints trailing behind him in the sand. Each step felt heavier, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't expected it. But fate had tied him to this fragile life. The puppy stirred weakly against his chest, a faint whimper escaping its throat. Cole tightened his hold. "It's okay," he murmured. "You're safe now. I've got you." Behind him, the surfboard rocked in the shallows, abandoned once more, drifting aimlessly without purpose. Ahead of him, Cole's home waited, a quiet cabin overlooking the shore, where solitude had ruled for years. That solitude was about to end. What began as another lonely morning walk had transformed into something far greater. Neither Cole nor the fragile pup in his arms knew it yet, but their fates had collided in a way that would change them both forever. The ocean had delivered tragedy before, but this time, it had given a second chance. The first night in Daniel's small beach house was unlike anything Maverick had ever known. For a puppy who had only known the slap of waves and the burn of salt water in his lungs, silence itself felt alien. The steady ticking of a clock on the wall seemed louder than the ocean. Every creak of the wooden floor made him flinch. He lay curled in a corner, his body still trembling even though he was finally dry and wrapped in a soft blanket. Daniel didn't push. He simply sat across the room on the couch, a book in his lap he wasn't really reading. Every so often he looked up, watching Maverick with quiet patience. He wanted to reach out, to reassure the dog, but he knew this wasn't the time. Trust couldn't be rushed. Maverick's amber eyes flicked to him, uncertain. When Daniel shifted slightly, the puppy's muscles tensed, as if bracing for something. But nothing came. No harsh voice, no sudden hand. Only stillness. Only calm. The night wore on. When Maverick finally dozed off, he whimpered in his sleep, paws twitching as if he were still fighting the current. Daniel got up slowly, placed another blanket nearby, and whispered, "You're safe now, buddy. No more waves. No more ropes." His voice carried the kind of assurance that didn't demand belief, but offered it freely. The next few days were a delicate dance. Maverick wouldn't eat from Daniel's hand at first. He only approached the food bowl when Daniel stepped away, glancing back nervously as though expecting it to vanish or be taken from him. Drinking water was no different. He'd lap quickly, then back away to watch the man's reaction. Daniel made no sudden moves. He sat on the porch with his coffee in the mornings, leaving the door open so Maverick could choose whether to come closer or stay hidden. Sometimes the puppy stayed curled under the kitchen table, peering out cautiously. Other times, curiosity nudged him forward. On the third morning, something shifted. Daniel was fixing the leash of his old surfboard, setting it against the porch rail when Maverick wandered out. The board caught the pup's gaze. His body stiffened instantly, tail tucking tight under him, ears flattening. He whimpered, a sharp, painful sound that stabbed straight through Daniel's chest. He dropped the board gently. Hey, not that one. You don't ever have to see that again." He crouched low, making himself smaller, softer. Maverick's paws shuffled backward, but his eyes locked on Daniel's hand as it extended, not grabbing, not demanding, only waiting. Minutes passed in silence. Then Maverick took one hesitant step forward. His nose twitched, catching the faint scent of salt and sunscreen on Daniel's skin. Another step. His tiny paw brushed against Daniel's fingers. That brief contact, fragile, trembling, was enough to change everything. "Good boy," Daniel whispered, his throat thick with emotion. "Good boy, Maverick." It was the first time he'd spoken the name aloud, a name he'd been repeating in his mind since the moment he pulled the dog from the water. Maverick. Because he had survived what no one thought he could. The puppy blinked at him, as if trying to understand. For the first time, his tail moved, not wagging fully, but twitching ever so slightly. It was enough to make Daniel's chest ache with hope. Days turned into a week. Maverick began to shadow Daniel cautiously, padding behind him from room to room. He still startled at sudden noises, the slam of a cupboard, the rattle of a window in the wind, but now he sought comfort instead of hiding. He'd creep closer, pressing his wet nose against Daniel's leg as if to ask, "Was that okay? Am I safe?" Each time, Daniel reassured him with a gentle pat, a soft murmur. Slowly, the pup began to believe it. One night, as rain pattered against the roof, Maverick did something unthinkable. Instead of curling in his corner, he hopped clumsily onto the couch where Daniel was stretched out. He hesitated, paws trembling, before settling down against the man's side. His small body pressed into the warmth, his breathing uneven at first, then calmer still. Daniel didn't move for hours. He just lay there, hand resting lightly on Maverick's back, feeling the rise and fall of fragile trust finally forming. He realized then that saving Maverick from the waves was only the beginning. The real rescue was happening here, in the quiet moments, in the rebuilding of faith that the world wasn't all cruelty. And for Maverick, for the puppy who should have drowned but hadn't, this was the first fragile step toward belonging. Trust was fragile, but it was growing. Maverick had begun following Daniel out onto the porch each morning, the salty wind stirring his ears as he sniffed the world with hesitant curiosity. Sometimes, he'd even rest his chin on Daniel's knee, amber eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for reassurance in the same direction his rescuer looked. But the ocean remained his greatest enemy. Its sound made him freeze. Its smell made his legs shake. Every wave that crashed onto the shore carried echoes of memory. The suffocating water, the tug of the rope, the helplessness. Daniel knew this was where the real healing had to happen. He had seen dogs carry trauma like chains, invisible but heavy, dragging them down even when no one else could see. Maverick couldn't run from the sea forever, not when it lapped at their doorstep each day. So one afternoon, Daniel clipped a leash to Maverick's collar and crouched low. "Just a walk, buddy. Just the sand. Nothing else." His tone was soft, coaxing. Maverick hesitated, paws rooted to the porch. Then, with a shaky breath, he stepped forward. The beach stretched wide under the late sun, golden light scattering across the waves. Children ran along the surf, laughing, their voices carrying high over the crash of water. Maverick froze at the sight, muscles trembling. But Daniel knelt, resting a calming hand against his chest. "I've got you," he whispered. "No one's tying you down again." Step by step, Maverick followed. The sand felt strange between his paws, but the warmth steadied him. He sniffed seaweed, flinched at a seagull's cry, and pressed himself closer to Daniel each time the tide rolled in. Then it happened. A little boy tripped too close to the incoming wave, stumbling with a frightened cry as water foamed around his ankles. Before Daniel could react, Maverick bolted forward. The leash tightened, but his instinct was unstoppable. He planted himself between the child and the water, hackles bristling, a deep growl rumbling in his chest. The boy froze, wide-eyed, staring at the small puppy standing like a shield. Daniel rushed over, scooping the boy up and handing him back to his mother, who had run over in alarm. "He's fine," Daniel assured, smiling gently. "Just a scare." But Maverick wasn't fine. His sides heaved as he stood facing the ocean, the growl fading into a whimper. His paws dug into the sand as if he were holding the tide back by sheer will. Only when Daniel crouched beside him, wrapping an arm around his trembling frame, did he finally relax. "You're braver than you know," Daniel murmured, kissing the top of his head. From that day, something changed in Maverick. He still feared the waves, but he no longer avoided the beach entirely. Each afternoon, Daniel brought him closer to the shoreline. Sometimes they sat for hours, Daniel sketching designs in his notebook while Maverick watched seagulls wheel overhead. Other times, Maverick chased driftwood sticks, careful never to let them roll too far into the tide. The bond deepened. Maverick began sleeping not just on the couch, but curled at the foot of Daniel's bed. At night, when the crash of waves outside grew too loud, he pressed against Daniel's legs, grounding himself in the steady rhythm of human breath. It was during one of these nights that Daniel woke to a sound that chilled him, the faintest scratching at the back door. Maverick was already alert, ears perked, body tense. Daniel slid quietly from the bed, flashlight in hand, and found only shadows in the yard. No footprints, no stray animals. But Maverick wouldn't settle for hours afterward, pacing circles around the door as though some invisible threat lingered beyond it. The real test came weeks later. A storm rolled in, the kind that turned the sea into a heaving monster. Daniel had secured his surfboards, shutters clapping in the wind, when he heard it, shouting, desperate, carried over the roar of the tide. A boy had been swept out, clinging to a piece of driftwood as the current dragged him further. The beach had emptied quickly once the storm began, leaving no lifeguards in sight. Daniel's instincts kicked in, but before he could even grab a rope, Maverick bolted. His small body cut across the sand like lightning, leash trailing behind. Without hesitation, he plunged into the water. "Maverick!" Daniel shouted, heart seizing with fear. The waves dwarfed the puppy, tossing him like a rag doll. But Maverick's focus was locked. Paws churned, nose high above the foam, fighting the pull that had once nearly killed him. Against all odds, he reached the boy. Tiny teeth gripped the sleeve of the child's jacket, pulling, tugging, refusing to let go. His body was weak compared to the current, but his will was iron. He barked, high-pitched and urgent, until Daniel reached them both, hauling them to shore with raw desperation. On the sand, the boy coughed and sobbed, his mother collapsing over him in relief. Maverick stood dripping, chest heaving, eyes wide, but not with fear this time. With something fiercer. Something alive. Daniel knelt beside him, tears mixing with seawater. "You did it," he whispered, pulling the trembling puppy into his arms. "You weren't just saved, you're a savior." And for the first time since the day he was tied to that surfboard, Maverick wagged his tail. The rescue during the storm changed everything. Word spread quickly across the small coastal town. The puppy once tied to drown had saved a boy from the sea. At first, it was just whispers among neighbors, stories retold in the diner, murmurs at the boardwalk. But soon, local reporters came knocking, cameras flashing as they tried to capture the unlikely hero. Maverick, however, wanted none of the attention. Each time strangers approached with eager hands and bright lenses, he tucked behind Daniel's legs, tail low, ears flat. He wasn't ready for the world spotlight. His comfort was in the quiet, in Daniel's steady presence, in the familiar scent of salt and home. Daniel shielded him as best he could. "He's still healing," he told reporters firmly. "He's not a story. He's a soul." Yet he knew deep down that Maverick's courage deserved recognition, not for fame, but for what it could mean. Weeks passed, and the ocean once again became part of Maverick's daily life. Only now he approached it differently. He still eyed the waves with wariness, but he no longer shrank back. Instead, he would sit beside Daniel, chest puffed, as though daring the tide to try again. Daniel noticed a pattern. Each time a child wandered too close to the surf, Maverick rose, pacing near them, watchful. If a ball bounced into the foam, he barked until someone retrieved it, never daring to let anyone be pulled where he once had been. It was instinct, yes, but also transformation. The ocean had once been his prison. Now, it was his battleground, and he would never let it win again. One crisp morning, Daniel took Maverick to a lifeguard training session. The head lifeguard, Carla, had heard about the storm rescue and invited them to watch. Dozens of dogs padded along the beach, strong breeds trained to assist in water rescues. Their handlers tossed buoys into the waves, and the dogs launched fearlessly after them, towing them back with precision. Maverick sat tense at Daniel's side, eyes locked on the water. Carla approached, kneeling to his level. "This the one?" she asked, smiling softly. Daniel nodded. "He's the one." Carla tilted her head, studying Maverick. "Small for the work, but I see fire in him." She reached out slowly, letting him sniff her hand before giving his ears a gentle scratch. For once, Maverick didn't recoil. He leaned in, just slightly, accepting her kindness. Later, when the dogs returned dripping and triumphant, Maverick stood. His paws carried him forward on their own, stopping at the waterline. A trainer tossed a buoy, and the splash made him flinch, but then he looked back at Daniel. Daniel's eyes were steady, filled with pride. "Only if you're ready, buddy," he said softly. Maverick stepped forward. One paw. Another. Then, with a shaky breath, he plunged in. The water closed around him, and for an instant, memory crushed him. The surfboard, the ropes, the terror. But then his paws found rhythm. His nose lifted. His body remembered the storm, the boy, the survival. He reached the buoy, grabbed it with determination, and paddled back, collapsing on the sand in front of Daniel. Cheers rose from the trainers. Carla knelt, her eyes wide. That dog, she whispered, is born for this. Training became a new rhythm. Maverick learned commands, signals, and techniques. He pulled practice buoys, swam alongside surfboards, and even learned how to steady panicked swimmers by circling them, nudging them towards safety. His fear of the ocean never vanished, but it hardened into purpose. For Daniel, watching Maverick grow was like witnessing a miracle unfold. This puppy who had once clung to life now gave it back to others. Each successful exercise carved away the shadows of his past, replacing them with strength. At home, however, Maverick never lost his gentleness. He followed Daniel everywhere, head resting on his knee during long nights, paw nudging his hand when grief tried to creep in. Daniel realized Maverick wasn't just healing himself. He was healing Daniel too, filling the quiet spaces of a life that had been far too lonely. The true test came sooner than anyone expected. A holiday weekend brought throngs of tourists to the beach. The sun was bright, laughter rang out, and the water seemed deceptively calm. But beneath the surface, a rip current twisted unseen. Daniel and Maverick were on patrol with Carla's team when the cries erupted. Two teenagers had been caught, their arms flailing, their bodies dragged further from shore with each desperate stroke. Panic rippled across the beach as families screamed for help. Carla blew her whistle, pointing, "Go!" Before Daniel could even react, Maverick lunged forward. His paws tore across the sand, muscles coiled with raw power. He hit the water hard, cutting through the waves like an arrow. The current tried to drag him under, but he pushed forward, head bobbing, eyes locked on the struggling swimmers. Gasps erupted from the crowd. "That's the puppy from the news," someone shouted. Phones rose, recording. Daniel sprinted after, heart pounding, but pride battled his fear. This wasn't the terrified puppy he'd pulled from the surfboard. This was Maverick, the rescuer, the fighter, the survivor. Reaching the teens, Maverick barked sharply, circling them as trained. One grabbed his vest handle, the other clung to the buoy tossed by Carla. With every ounce of strength, Maverick pulled, his small frame slicing against the rip's pull. The ocean roared, but he roared louder in spirit. Together, they reached shallow water, where lifeguards rushed in to drag the teens safely to shore. Cheers exploded, echoing across the beach. Maverick stumbled onto the sand, dripping and trembling, but his tail wagged high. Daniel fell to his knees, scooping him close, tears streaming down his face. "You're not just surviving anymore," Daniel whispered, voice breaking. "You're saving lives." And the crowd around them knew, without question, that they were witnessing the rise of a true hero. The video of Maverick's daring holiday rescue spread like wildfire. Within hours, clips flooded social media, the small German Shepherd mix battling the rip current, pulling two teenagers towards safety. Headlines called him the surfboard survivor turned lifesaver. Daniel never intended for Maverick to be famous, but the world decided otherwise. Reporters returned, their questions endless, their cameras flashing. This time, Maverick didn't shrink entirely. He still sought Daniel's side, still pressed close when the crowd grew too loud, but he no longer trembled. He held his head higher, amber eyes steady, as though he finally understood the story being told about him. Carla approached Daniel one morning, a folded vest in her hands. Embroidered across the back was a single word: rescue. "He's earned it," she said simply. Daniel swallowed hard, slipping the vest over Maverick's back. The pup stood tall as the straps were secured, tail swishing slowly. Children clapped. Strangers wiped their eyes. And Daniel, his throat tight, his hands trembling, knelt to press his forehead to Maverick's. "You were once left to drown," he whispered, voice breaking. "But now you're the reason others get to live." Recognition followed. Maverick was honored at the town hall, his story told in classrooms, his picture hung at the lifeguard station. Yet for all the accolades, he remained unchanged in the ways that mattered most. He still curled at Daniel's feet every night. He still patted softly after him from room to room. He still whimpered in his dreams sometimes, the ocean's ghosts never fully gone. But now, those whimpers were steadied by a hand, by a voice, by the knowledge that he was no longer alone. The bond between man and dog deepened with every rescue, every quiet moment. Daniel often caught himself staring at Maverick, marveling at the miracle of his existence. Had he been a second later that day, the ocean would have claimed him. Had Maverick surrendered to fear, he would never have known the joy of belonging, the pride of purpose. Instead, here he was, alive, loved, transformed. One evening, the town hosted a charity event for animal rescues. Maverick sat proudly at Daniel's side, vest gleaming under the string lights. A young girl approached timidly, holding a crumpled dollar in her hand. Can I pet him?" she asked. Daniel smiled. "If he says yes." Maverick sniffed the girl's hand, then leaned forward, pressing his head gently against her palm. The girl's face lit with wonder. "He feels safe?" she whispered. Daniel blinked back tears. Yes, he thought. Safe. That was the miracle, that a puppy once discarded as worthless, once bound and abandoned to die, could become a source of safety and hope for others. At the end of the night, Daniel and Maverick walked home along the moonlit beach. The tide whispered gently, calmer now, as if acknowledging the one who had defied it. Maverick trotted ahead, then paused, standing at the shoreline. He looked back at Daniel, tail wagging, and for the first time in his young life, he stepped into the surf without hesitation. The water swirled around his legs, cool and steady. No panic, no struggle, only peace. He barked once, sharp and joyful, before bounding back to Daniel's side. Daniel laughed, scooping him up despite being soaked. "That's it, buddy. You've beaten it." Maverick licked his face, tail whipping against Daniel's chest. And in that moment, under the moon's silver glow, Daniel realized the truth. Maverick wasn't just a dog who had survived. He was a testament that even when the world tried to drown you, even when every odd was against you, life could still rise from the depths. Stronger, braver, unbreakable. But Maverick's story wasn't over. The ocean would always test him, and there would always be lives in need of saving. For now, though, as the waves curled harmlessly at their feet, he was just a dog beside his man. Loved. Home. The surfboard that once carried him toward death now leaned forgotten in the garage. In its place stood something greater, a dog who had learned to fight the tide and win. And the world would never forget the puppy who should not have survived, but did. Months passed, and Maverick's reputation as a rescue dog only grew. Tourists still came asking for him. Children ran up to hug him, and local lifeguards proudly called him their smallest teammate. Yet for Daniel, the greatest miracle wasn't the fame or the rescues. It was watching Maverick simply live. The puppy who once shivered in corners now bounded across the sand each morning, ears flopping, nose chasing the wind. He leapt at butterflies, wrestled driftwood, and sprawled belly up in the sun without fear. He had learned joy. And Daniel, who had once lived alone with the ghosts of his own past, found that Maverick had healed him too. The house no longer felt quiet. The silence was filled with paws skittering across the floor, with soft snores at night, with the steady rhythm of companionship. But the ocean was never done testing them. One dawn, a fisherman banged on Daniel's door. A kayak capsized, he panted. Two people, currents pulling them fast. Daniel's heart raced, but Maverick was already on his feet, vest clinking as if he knew before words were spoken. Together they sprinted to the shore. The waves were high, foaming with menace. Far out, two figures clung desperately to an overturned kayak. Their cries barely carried above the roar. Carla's team was on the way, but there was no time to waste. Daniel knelt, gripping Maverick's harness. His eyes locked with the pup's. "You don't have to," he said, voice breaking. "You've done enough. You've proven everything." But Maverick whined, pushing against Daniel's chest, tail stiff with determination. His gaze burned with a message Daniel couldn't ignore. "This is who I am now." With a sharp nod, Daniel unclipped the leash. "Go." Maverick tore into the surf, slicing the waves like a seasoned rescuer. His body vanished, reappeared, surged forward again. The sea fought to claim him, but this time he met it not as a victim, not as prey, but as a warrior. When he reached the kayakers, he circled, barking, nudging them toward the buoy Daniel had thrown. One man grabbed Maverick's vest handle, clinging for dear life. Stroke by stroke, Maverick pulled, lungs burning, paws thrashing, but never letting go. By the time the lifeguards arrived, Maverick had already dragged them halfway back. Together, the team hauled the men to safety, collapsing on the sand in exhaustion. Cheers erupted. Someone shouted, "That's the dog from the surfboard story." Phones filmed. Tears flowed. But Daniel saw none of it. He was on his knees, clutching Maverick against his chest as the pup panted heavily, sides heaving. He pressed his forehead to wet fur, whispering through choked sobs, "You're everything I never knew I needed." That night, Maverick slept curled against Daniel's side, paws twitching as though he were still swimming. Daniel stayed awake, watching him, heart swelling with pride and fear all at once. Heroes weren't supposed to come in such small, fragile bodies. And yet, sometimes they did. As the years passed, Maverick became a symbol. His story was told in schools, painted on murals, and written in newspapers far beyond their town. People said he was proof that even the broken, the abandoned, the ones the world tried to drown, could rise to save others. And Daniel carried that truth every day. On one particularly golden evening, when the sun melted into the horizon, Daniel and Maverick stood side by side at the shoreline. The surf whispered softly, no longer an enemy but an old rival respected. Children laughed nearby, parents called from blankets, and lifeguards kept watch from their towers. Maverick lifted his head, gazing at the horizon. His ears twitched, his tail wagged, and he barked once, strong, fearless, victorious. Daniel smiled, tears shining in his eyes. "That's right," he murmured. "You were never meant to drown. You were meant to live. To show the world how to fight." The waves curled at their feet, harmless now. The surfboard that once carried death sat forgotten in the garage. In its place stood a legacy written not in wood or rope, but in courage, loyalty, and love. Maverick's story was no longer just his own. It belonged to every person who had ever felt discarded, every soul who had been tied down by life's cruelty, every heart that had nearly sunk beneath the tide. Because if a puppy left to drown could rise again, could become a hero, a savior, a symbol, then maybe anyone could. And as the stars blinked awake over the ocean, Maverick lay at Daniel's side, content. Not as a victim, not even just as a survivor, but as what he had always been meant to be, a beacon against the tide.